There's an old saying, money can't buy happiness. But in some cases, money doesn't just fail to bring happiness. It invites something much, much worse. When Charlotte Hayes married into the wealthy Langford family, she seemed to have everything: a husband who adored her, a sprawling estate, and access to a fortune most people could only dream of. She was charming, beautiful, and well-spoken, the very image of a high society wife. But Charlotte had a secret, one she had buried deep. And secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. No one in the Langford family could have predicted how it would all unravel. But by the time they realized who Charlotte really was, it was too late. Welcome to True Crime Details. Please subscribe and turn on notifications to get more fascinating crime stories. Thank you to all our viewers and subscribers. To the world, Charlotte Hayes had won the ultimate prize, an enviable life wrapped in luxury, wealth, and influence. From the moment she stepped into the Langford family's world, she was seen as the perfect addition, graceful, intelligent, and seemingly bred for high society. Her romance with Andrew Langford was a whirlwind. They met at a charity gala, one of those impossibly glamorous affairs where champagne flowed endlessly and conversations were spoken in hushed, polished tones. Andrew was used to being the center of attention, but that night, all eyes were on Charlotte. She had the effortless elegance of a woman who belonged in that world, her deep brown eyes carrying mysterious glint that made people lean in just a little closer when she spoke. The way she moved, the way she charmed everyone in the room, it was as if she had always been part of their circle. But she hadn't. Charlotte was a mystery. The Langfords had always been cautious about outsiders. When you're one of the wealthiest families in the country, you don't let just anyone in. Background checks were standard, and every potential spouse or associate was carefully scrutinized. Yet, somehow, Charlotte had slipped through effortlessly. Andrew didn't care about the whispers. His family had their doubts, especially his mother, Vivian Langford, a woman known for her icy demeanor and sharp intuition. But Andrew was infatuated. Charlotte made him feel alive in a way no one else ever had. She was spontaneous, passionate, and unpredictable. Everything he wasn't used to in his carefully curated world. They traveled through Europe, dined in the finest restaurants, and attended exclusive galas where she dazzled everyone she met. If there were questions about her past, Charlotte brushed them off with a light-hearted laugh. "My parents were never as glamorous as yours, darling," she would say, deflecting with humor whenever conversation turned personal. "I learned to make my own way." To Andrew, that only made her more alluring. She wasn't like the women he had dated before, the ones from established families with predictable upbringings and carefully arranged futures. Charlotte had an air of mystery, and he was captivated by it. Within months, they were inseparable. She moved into his penthouse in Manhattan, her designer wardrobe blending seamlessly with his world of wealth. The engagement came soon after, a proposal in Paris, on the terrace of a five-star hotel overlooking the Seine. The tabloids exploded with headlines about the billionaire heir and his stunning fiancée. The wedding was a spectacle, held at the Langford estate in the Hamptons. It was the kind of event that socialites gossiped about for years. Every detail was perfect. White roses flown in from France, crystal chandeliers lining the outdoor reception, and a guest list that included celebrities, politicians, and business moguls. Charlotte was radiant. As she walked down the aisle in a custom-designed gown, no one could take their eyes off her. She had done it. Secured a place among the elite. But while the Langfords were toasting to their new family member, someone else was watching. Someone who knew exactly who Charlotte really was. And they weren't about to let her forget it. At first, it was easy to dismiss the strange occurrences as nothing more than paranoia. After all, Charlotte was adjusting to a new life, one that came with constant public attention, invasive press, and whispers from people who had known each other for generations. Every move she made was analyzed. Every word she spoke was dissected. She told herself that the discomfort she felt was simply part of becoming a Langford. But then, the unease started creeping in. It began subtly, so subtly that anyone else might not have noticed. A lingering glance from a stranger at an event, a fleeting moment of recognition in someone's eyes before they quickly looked away. Then, there was the woman at the charity fundraiser. The night had been going well, filled with polite conversation and perfectly chilled champagne. Charlotte was speaking with a group of guests when she felt it. Someone staring. When she turned, her eyes locked with an older woman standing across the room. She was in her 60s, dressed in an elegant emerald gown, her face slightly paler than it should have been. The woman's expression was frozen, her lips parting slightly as if she was about to say something. Charlotte knew that look. It was the look of recognition. And yet, she didn't recognize the woman at all. Before she could react, the woman whispered something to her husband, her hand tightening around his wrist. He frowned, glancing briefly in Charlotte's direction before shaking his head. Charlotte's pulse quickened. She turned to Andrew, placed a hand on his arm, and forced a smile. "Darling, I need to freshen up," she murmured before slipping away. Inside the powder room, she took a slow breath. She told herself it was nothing, just a random guest who had mistaken her for someone else. But the tightness in her chest told her otherwise. Then came the phone calls. At first, they were sporadic, 1 or 2 every couple weeks, always from an unknown number. Whenever Charlotte answered, silence greeted her on the other end. Then, just as she was about to hang up, breathing. Not deep, heavy breathing, like in a cheap horror movie. This was different. Slow, measured, almost like someone was waiting, listening. Then the line would go dead. Andrew never knew. Charlotte made sure of that. She deleted the call logs, never reacted when the phone rang, and carried on as if everything was fine. She convinced herself it was nothing. Maybe a journalist trying to dig into her past. Maybe a jealous ex of Andrew's playing games. But deep down, she knew better. Then, the letters started arriving. They weren't mailed. There was no postage, no return address. Just small, white envelopes slipped under the door of the penthouse. At first, she didn't open them. She burned them in the kitchen sink, without reading a single word. But the third letter, she made the mistake of reading. It was short, just 4 words. "You can't hide forever." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling. For the first time in years, she felt the past creeping in, pressing against the life she had built, threatening to destroy everything. And the worst part? She had no idea who was sending them. Andrew Langford had always trusted his instincts. He wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed himself, and he certainly wasn't the kind to question the woman he loved. But something was wrong. At first, he tried to ignore it. Charlotte had always been private about her past, and he respected that. She told him she had grown up in a modest family, that she had worked hard to reinvent herself, that she didn't have the deep generational ties that the Langfords did. That was fine. Andrew didn't care about pedigree. He cared about Charlotte. But lately, things have changed. The phone calls, the way she jumped whenever an unknown number flashed across her screen, the way she clutched her phone to her chest, turning her body slightly whenever he walked into the room, as if she didn't want him to see. Then there were the letters. Andrew had never seen one himself, but something told him they existed. He noticed the way Charlotte's hands trembled slightly when she gathered the mail, the way she flipped through it quickly, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly before she stuffed certain envelopes into her bag. Still, he didn't press her. Not until the night he found the letter she had missed. Charlotte had left for a weekend spa retreat, a last-minute decision, something about needing to clear her head. Andrew had stayed behind, half relieved to have some space. The tension between them had been growing, an unspoken strain neither of them dared address. That's when he saw it, a small white envelope, half hidden beneath a stack of fashion magazines on her nightstand. He knew he shouldn't invade her privacy, but something in his gut told him he had to. He opened it. The words were scrawled in uneven, smudged ink. "You can't hide forever." His breath caught in his throat. What the hell was this? The handwriting was shaky, rushed, as if written by someone barely able to control their emotions. The lack of a signature, the absence of any identifying details. It all felt deliberate. Andrew's mind raced. Who was Charlotte hiding from? His first instinct was to call her, demand an explanation. But something stopped him. Instead, he sat with the letter for a long time. turning it over in his hands, his mind piecing together all the things he had ignored. The inconsistencies in her past, the way she avoided conversations about her childhood, the fact that no one from her so-called old life had ever appeared, no childhood friends, no distant relatives. It was as if Charlotte had materialized out of thin air. Andrew needed answers. By Monday morning, he had hired a private investigator. The man came highly recommended. Expensive, discreet, thorough. Andrew gave him a simple task. Find out everything there was to know about Charlotte Hayes. Within a week, the investigator had a name. Charlotte Hayes wasn't real. And that was just the beginning. Charlotte Hayes didn't exist. That was the first thing the investigator told Andrew when he handed over the file. Andrew sat frozen in his office, staring at the crisp folder lying on his desk. It felt wrong to open it, like violating something sacred, but he had no choice. He flipped it open. A grainy black and white mugshot stared back at him. It wasn't Charlotte. Not exactly. The woman in the photo had the same striking features, the sharp cheekbones, the full lips, but she looked younger. Her hair was lighter, her eyes harder. There was no warmth in her expression. Below the photo was a name, Lena Carter. Andrew's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the report. Charlotte, no, Lena, hadn't just changed her name. She had erased an entire life. Lena Carter had been a con artist, not just a petty scammer or a woman with a few secrets. She had been part of a sophisticated operation that targeted wealthy men. The game was simple: seduce, manipulate, and disappear with their money. It was a scheme that had worked time and time again. Lena had moved across the country, reinventing herself in different cities, leaving behind a trail of men who had been charmed, swindled, and discarded. And then one day, she disappeared completely. The investigator had managed to piece together what had happened. Lena's last target had been Victor Malone, a man unlike the others. Wealthy, yes, but not the kind of man who called the police when he was wronged. Victor wasn't just rich. He was dangerous, ruthless. His money came from businesses that weren't exactly legal, and the people who worked for him weren't the kind you want to cross. Lena had thought he was just another easy mark. She was wrong. The night she tried to vanish with his money, something had gone terribly wrong. The official reports were vague. A break-in at Victor's estate. A struggle. Someone had died, though the details were murky. No official charges were filed, but one thing was clear. Lena Carter had fled that night and never looked back. She had spent the next few years burying her past. New name, new identity. She disappeared from every database, erased every record of her old life. By the time she resurfaced as Charlotte Hayes, she was untraceable. Until now, Andrew's hands shook as he closed the file. This wasn't just about deception. It wasn't just a woman running from a bad decision. Charlotte hadn't just taken money from the wrong man. She had taken something more. And now, the past was coming back. Not for the money. For her. The storm outside had been brewing for hours, casting eerie shadows across the Langford estate. Rain pattered against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the tension that hung thick in the air. Inside the grand mansion, Andrew stood near the fireplace, the flames flickering behind him as Charlotte sat on a velvet couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She knew the moment she walked in and saw the file on the coffee table. There was no use pretending. Andrew's voice was low, steady, but filled with something she had never heard before: betrayal. "Who are you?" Charlotte opened her mouth, but no words came out. Not yet. She had spent years perfecting the art of deception, crafting lies so seamlessly that they felt like the truth. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a casual manipulation. This was the man she had married. And he knew everything. The room was too quiet. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. "Say something." His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Charlotte inhaled sharply. She could lie. She could spin a story, say it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. She could cry, beg, make him believe that none of it mattered. But she saw his face. It was over. "It's true." The words barely left her lips before Andrew exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. She could see the war in his eyes. The man who had loved her, the man who had built a life with her, was being replaced by someone else. Someone colder. You use me? No, she said quickly. I love you, Andrew. I do. That part was real. He let out a bitter laugh. And what part wasn't? Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Both of them froze. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. Charlotte's breath hitched. Andrew turned toward the door, but she was already on her feet, grabbing his wrist. Don't, she whispered. He frowned. What? The door burst open. The first gunshot rang out before Andrew even had time to react. Charlotte screamed as he stumbled backward, blood blossoming across his shirt. And then, standing in the doorway, was Victor Malone. His silhouette was sharp against the stormy night, the gun in his hand still smoking. His dark eyes flicked over Andrew briefly before landing on Charlotte. He smiled. Did you really think you could run forever? Charlotte's heart pounded so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. Please, she whispered. Victor took a slow step inside, his presence filling the massive foyer as 2 men followed behind him, their expressions blank. Andrew groaned, clutching his side, trying to move, but one of Victor's men pressed a boot against his chest, keeping him down. I should have killed you the first time, Victor said, tilting his head. But you were smart. I almost admired that. Charlotte shook her head, tears slipping down her face. Victor, please, you don't have to do this. He chuckled. But I do, darling, because if I let you live, what kind of message does that send? The second gunshot was louder than the first. By the time the police arrived, the storm had passed, but inside the Langford estate, the damage had already been done. The Langford estate was in chaos. Flashing red and blue lights cast eerie patterns across the pristine marble floors, illuminating the wreckage of a life that unraveled in a matter of minutes. Officers moved to the mansion with grim efficiency, their voices clipped as they secured the scene. Andrew Langford lay on a stretcher, pale but conscious, his blood-stained shirt cut open by paramedics trying to stabilize him. The bullet had missed anything vital, but the shock, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of what had just happened, none of that could be bandaged or stitched up. Charlotte, if that was even her real name anymore, was silent. She sat in the back of a police cruiser, her wrists cuffed, her once perfect hair falling around her face in tangled waves. The weight of everything crashed down on her all at once. Victor Malone was dead. The man who had hunted her, who had finally caught up to her, was now lying in a body bag, his reign of terror over. One of his men had fled. The other lay slumped against a grand staircase, his weapon useless at his side. But none of that mattered now, because this wasn't a victory. It was the end of everything. Hours passed before the questioning began. Charlotte sat across from 2 detectives in a dimly lit interrogation room, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The heat from it barely registered. Detective Morales, a seasoned officer with tired eyes, leaned forward. You want to tell us what really happened here? Charlotte exhaled shakily. I didn't kill Victor. Morales nodded slowly. We know that. Ballistics confirmed that Andrew Langford fired the shot that killed Malone. Looks like self-defense. She swallowed hard. She hadn't even seen Andrew pick up the gun. Everything had happened so fast. The gunfire, the shouting, the blur of movement. But you still have a lot to explain, Morales continued. We ran your fingerprints, Charlotte. Or should I say, Lena Carter? She flinched at the sound of her real name. It had been years since she'd heard it spoken aloud. You're wanted in 3 states of fraud, Morales said, flipping through a thick file. Identity theft, wire fraud, grand larceny. And that's just what we confirmed so far. Charlotte closed her eyes. There was no point in running anymore. Tell me, Lena, Morales said, voice softer now. Was any of it real? She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Had she loved Andrew? Yes. Had she wanted this life? Yes. But none of that mattered now. I didn't want to end like this, she whispered. Morales sighed, closing the file. It never does. The trial was swift. Charlotte, Lena, pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecution had enough evidence to bury her, but with Victor Malone's death in her history as his victim, the court showed leniency. Andrew never spoke to her again. He didn't show up at the hearings, didn't call. The love they had shared, the whirlwind romance that had captivated society, it was nothing more than ashes now. He moved on. The Langford name remained untarnished. The media spinning the story as a tragic case of deception, of a man too in love to see the truth. As for Charlotte, she had nothing left. No wealth, no glamour, no carefully constructed identity. Just an orange jumpsuit, a prison cell, and the knowledge that no matter how far she had run, the past had always been faster.